Hey everybody, welcome to Represent Jesus Well, an RCC podcast where we're all about uncovering ways people endure, live, and lead that represent Jesus well. And today I am super excited because I get to sit down with a very special person who actually spent the morning today speaking 3 different times, Sharon Hodde Miller, who's a pastor and author of 3 books, but the most recent is The Cost of Control, Why We Crave It, the Anxiety It Gives, and the Real Promise, the Power God Promises. I've read the book. I listened to you speak today. I showed you my underlines. There are hundreds of them in this book, it feels like. And I just want to say thank you for writing it. And thanks for being on the podcast.
It's been great being here with you guys. I love your church.
Awesome.
I love you guys. So it's been fun.
Thank you so much for being here. So we're talking about this book. But before we even get into the book, you just spent 3 services here sharing this excellent message. But I'm curious. You go all around the country to speak, and I'm curious the difference for you between when you go somewhere to speak and then when you go back to the church plant you and your husband Ike planted in Durham, North Carolina, called Bright City Church. What's the difference? How does that feel different? Like coming back to earth, maybe? I don't know.
I think, so my favorite place to preach is our own church.
Really?
And it's because I know our people and I know what's going on in their lives. I know their stories. I know their struggles. And so I know how the gospel that I'm preaching is going to be relevant to them in like very grounded ways. And I feel more urgency in that. I also feel whenever you travel and speak, especially at like larger conferences, you feel, at least I feel like there's a celebrity aspect to it that is very weird. And I don't feel that in my church. I feel much more like this is my church family. They see me with my kids. They see me at my best and my worst. And so it just feels much more spiritually healthy in a lot of ways. And so I really love that as well.
Yeah, do you ever have moments like you're out and you kind of experience the like, oh, wow, this is a great speaker, this is a great author. And then you go back and you're like, oh, wait, these guys don't think about me like that.
Yeah. You just, because it is spiritually fame is spiritually toxic.
Yeah.
And I think when you're in like a conference setting where people think they know you, but they actually don't, it really encourages that dynamic. And I can feel it. And it feels very uncomfortable to me. And it's not the fault of the people there. It's not the fault of the conference organizers. It's just because you're not in community with them. And so I don't experience that in church at all. It seems like the antidote to that dynamic, at least for our church.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's neat because I think when people travel to speak and that's all they do, I'm sure that's a really difficult pitfall not to fall into. But some people at your church don't even know like any of those things, right? It's different. Like you just show up and they can call you on your stuff, which is great.
Yeah, exactly.
But you said something that's interesting to me. You said community is kind of the cure for that. As we've talked and as I read your book, one of the things that kept coming to mind is in church, often there is this thing where people choose not to attend or not become a Christian, and their biggest reason is often something called, like, they believe Christians are hypocritical. They're hypocrites. And what I kept on seeing in your book, especially in the chapter about reputation and managing your reputation, how much it's easy to fall into this reputation management idea where you're trying to put out there for somebody else what they see. And this podcast is called Represent Jesus Well because we're trying to do that well. And you can't fake it for too long. After a while, it just runs out. So I'm curious, as you think about reputation management and hypocrisy in the church, what does that speak to you? What comes to mind as you're thinking about that?
So we actually have a lot of people at our church who are coming with church hurt, and they've been out of church for a while, or they're coming from another church feeling very wounded or feeling very hesitant to be in church again. And that's not something that we ever set out to like attract that demographic. I think it's probably the natural overflow of just how we treat people generally. Like when we view any person who walks through the door of our church, it's like that is God's kid. And so however I treat that person, I'm accountable to him. And I feel very sobered by that. Like I feel very humbled by that. I'm not going to stand over that person and wag my finger and tell them, why they are doing their life wrong. I really want to care for them as if I am accountable to God, because I am. And so that has shaped our culture where I think people feel very safe at our church. And a lot of people come and say, I feel safe at your church in a way that I haven't before. But there's also a temptation there that Ike and I are very aware of, is that we could easily position our church as the answer. And I think that's a temptation most churches face. Anytime you think of your church as a product to market, is you're always kind of thinking, what are we offering that no other church is offering? And then we can market that, to people. It's like a very consumeristic mindset. And so it would be easy for us to say, yes, we're not doing what these other churches are doing. Like, come be safe here. But if we did that, we would be setting ourselves up to fail, and we would be setting them up for more pain, because the reality is we are not the answer. Jesus is the answer. And so we say that often. We say that often to people, is we say, we're so glad you're here. We want this to be a safe place for you, but also we are sinners. Like Ike and I are sinners. We will disappoint you. Like, I'm just going to tell you now, like, we are going to disappoint you. We are flawed people, but the only person that won't disappoint you is Jesus. And the only person that doesn't have skeletons in their closet is Jesus. And so we're really like, the place that I want to be at, and I have days where I'm there and days when I'm not, is if someone eventually does leave our church because they're upset with us, but if they're still good with Jesus, then that is a success. And that's the place that I want to be, where even if they ultimately decide this is not a community for them, that we are restoring their relationship with Christ. And that is actually our mission statement, is helping people take their next step towards Christ. Yeah. And so every Sunday we say, wherever you're coming from, whatever, if you've been out of church a while or if you're coming with church hurt, our question for you is, what is your next step towards Christ? And how can we partner with you so we're not winning them to Bright City, but restoring them to Jesus?
Yeah, so I love that. A couple of things. You said that you tell your church often that we're sinners. Like, we're going to mess up. We're going to disappoint you. I'm curious, when are you most tempted to manage your image and look like you're not? That's a hard question.
Now, I can answer very easily.
Okay.
So the thing that actually really bothers me, we experienced this in the last several years. I'm sure you guys did too, where we're leading through a really divided time. And so anytime we made a decision, we were going to disappoint people. Like, we just knew that was going to happen. And, we researched everything. We sought wise counsel. We searched scripture, all of that before we made our decisions, but it still was not enough. But the thing that really chafed me
Sure. Yeah, I want to hear it.
was when people would accuse us of not being biblical or not adhering, to scripture or Jesus' teachings, or like becoming political. And y'all have already like experienced this in our like casual conversation. I have like a big pride streak and like a big self-righteousness streak. And so when people say to me, like, you're not following scripture, I'm like, you brought a knife to a gunfight. Like, you don't know, like, you don't even know. Like, I have an MDiv, I have a PhD. Like, you want to talk about scripture? Like, let's go. And so it makes me so angry. Like, I want to throw all the scripture at them and be like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And so that is the image that really, if people accuse me of not being biblical, I really struggle. I want to justify myself, and I want to explain to them why, like, I am more biblical,
Yeah, for sure. I totally get that. And it's so weird, right? Because, people would probably even use biblical things to come at you with that comment. So it's like you're setting up this battle. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you talked about is anxiousness and anxiety. Mm-hmm. And I think you quoted Friedman, or I've heard it. Mm-hmm. I think a couple of different people have talked about it, but the line is something like, the most powerful person in the room is the person who's the most anxious, unless there's a calm presence. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And when you're talking about this anxiety and this maybe competition of like who's more biblical, like there's this nervousness, there's this fear, there's a battle that erupts. How have you been able to let go of the control, right? And how have you been able to fight to be the calm presence?
I'm not very good at it.
Okay. Sure.
My husband is actually much better at it, and he's an internal processor by nature. And he's really good at the thing that he does really well is he understands that whatever is like being said to me or whatever question is being asked of me or accusation launched at me is not really the thing that we're talking about. And so he has the presence of mind to wait and patiently discern, where is this actually coming from? I am like a fish on bait. Like,
took it. We're gonna
you
fight
like
this
have
out.
this shiny thing, I'm like, pew! And so I tend to go like right at, and thankfully we don't have many situations, like in leadership situations, where that is the dynamic that is happening. It used to be, though, like on occasion when we did, I just would go into debate mode. And it's really hard for me not to. But that is something that I'm learning from my husband and from people like Edwin Friedman, who you just quoted, about understanding the most anxious person in the room is the most powerful person in the room. And they are the ones that control the temperature. And so you have to resist that temptation to be driven by that. But it's not, I am a debater by nature. Like that's what makes me a good preacher, but that is also my shadow side. Big time.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how that line relates to control? Like, so when you're in those circumstances and you're kind of debating back and forth, how is that this desire to control a situation and how does that like play out?
Well, what this book has helped me to also recognize is that when I do go into debate mode, that is about control. And I'm verbally strong. And so I use my words to push people around. I'm used to doing that. And again, I don't think I saw it as control because I thought I'm just very convincing.
I am right. And you just haven't learned that
I'm
yet.
not being controlling. I'm just right. Like,
I hear you.
So I've been on a journey. But yeah, so I am very strong with my words, but also believing that knowledge is really powerful. And that was, we tend to think of the most common form of control being power. But in Genesis 3, at ground zero, what they reach for is not power, it's knowledge. And I think that is actually the most common way that we try to feel in control and to control other people. We turn to knowledge to empower us. That's how a lot of us responded to the pandemic. But we also pelt one another with data because we think that knowledge will move them. And that is how, for a long time, I have approached people in my own mind, I would think, this person who disagrees with the decision we made, if I just can talk to them and explain to them why we made the decision that we made, and I can present this airtight argument, then I will change their minds. And unfortunately, knowledge just does not have that kind of power. And when I overestimate knowledge and its influence, what it does instead, that cost of control, is it just creates anxiety in me. And so I would be the one awake at night, tossing and turning, thinking again over and over, like, what if I said it this way? What if I said it this way? What if I presented the information this way? Then they would change their mind. And so it's costing me sleep, like actually. And then very often, if I'm actually engaging them in conversation, it's also costing me my relationship with them because people don't want to be pushed and they don't appreciate it. Even if you're doing it very gently, they will push back. And so it was fracturing my relationships with people. And so that has been, I will say, very helpful, that even though it is hard for me in the moment not to like go into debate mode, if I'm given enough time to just reflect on, oh, this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to control this person with knowledge and information. This is what it's doing to me personally. That is really helpful for me to finally get off that train and stop pushing.
Yeah, it's so interesting because one of the things you highlight in the book is you have agency. Like, agency is a key to understanding what power you do have that can be used in a healthy way. It's interesting because I was a rhetoric major in college, so thinking about debate is interesting to me. And one of the things that I found fascinating during that time was learning that you don't actually convince people with logic. People are not convinced by logic. They're convinced actually by identification. If they can identify with you and see a story in you and what you're telling them that they can believe to be true, they'll be more likely to believe you. But that can seem really sinister, and it can be used in a sinister way, a manipulative way. However, what I love about it is it requires community. And it requires an understanding of somebody's story and that sort of thing. So I'd love you to speak a little bit about agency and how that is not the same as control.
Yeah, well, real quick, one thing that reminds me of too, a parable that has been really helpful for me in thinking about influence is the parable of the sower. And the way people engage one another online in the comment section is as if Jesus's takeaway from that parable was like, just throw the seed harder.
Yeah.
And like throw more of it.
Jam it down the throat.
As if that was like the takeaway. And that's not the takeaway. Like the reason it's not accepting the seed is the quality of the soil. And to me, that's a more pastoral question, is why is the soil bad? And I don't have a ton of control over that, but I do have a little bit. And some people are coming into our church with rocks in their soil or thorns in their soil because of wounds. And so, what can I do to be a part of that healing so that they can receive? And it sounds like identification is also like a great way of thinking about how to better that soil for receiving the seed.
Yeah.
So that's just like a side note that reminded me of. But agency, so the arc of the book is that God doesn't give us control, but he does give us agency. And the way that I define agency is it is the power to influence ourselves and our circumstances. And the operative word there being influence, not control.
Yeah.
So we don't have control over very much at all, but we do have a lot of influence. And so it's not that God is saying just let go and let God, like just roll over, but he's saying you need to put down the power that I have not given you to pick up the power that I have. And we see agency in Genesis 1 and 2, where Adam and Eve are not in control, but they're not puppets, they're not prisoners, they're not slaves. And so they have tremendous influence in the garden. And so a big part of the book was looking at what agency, what influence like did they have in Genesis 1 and 2, and then how can we operate that as well?
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, in just the way that you talk about agency, it helps me to just understand. And in the book, you talked about how it's so easy to try and force your will on things, but it's so freeing when you can think, at least this is how I interpreted it, I can do this, and I'm not like putting my will on somebody, but I'm expressing my opinion. Like this is my takeaway in a lot of ways. I can express my opinion. I can be kind, I can encourage, I can do all these great words, but it's not a forceful thing. And I think when people experience that from you, you can actually help them to be more excited about being part of whatever you're a part of.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So I want to switch lanes a little bit. In this, and you commented about this on Instagram.
Okay.
Nobody's asked you this question.
Okay.
You talked about identity.
Yeah.
And how much it has the power of control over our identities is a really slippery thing. Specifically, I know this is a flashpoint, so I'm not going to go. We don't have to go all the way to the flashpoint, but I want to dip the toe in a bit.
Yeah.
Specifically with understanding identity, I want to ask the question, there's this advice people give people, you just got to go and find yourself or discover yourself. Why is that bad advice, or is it? I'm curious.
So we live in a culture, I'm probably not going to answer your question directly.
It's fine.
I'm going to let it hang in the ether.
That's great.
We live in a culture that preaches salvation by identity.
Yeah.
That once you find your true self, that will set you free. The trouble is there is no objective measure of the true self. Like, how do you know you found it? And the only measure we really have is a feeling.
Which are fleeting. And
And unfortunately, what constitutes your true self also can evolve, like when I look back on my life thus far, like which Sharon was the true Sharon,
Good question.
Because when I was in college, I thought I was going to be a psychologist. And then I took developmental psychology and I was like, bye. And that was not for me. And there was actually, when I was younger than that, I thought I was going to be an archaeologist. There's all these different iterations of myself. Which one was the true me?
Yeah, and they're all based on occupation
too.
too.
And even you could say, well, the Sharon that's doing ministry. Well, for a long time, I thought I was going to be doing women's ministry my whole life. But now I'm a pastor. And so it's a very squishy, and I think it's fascinating that the language that we use to talk about identity, specifically gender, is to say that it is fluid. And I think that is true in the same way that Jesus tells the parable of the house built on rock and the house built on sand. I think these fluid identities that we are building ourselves on top of are houses built on sand. They are fluid in the sense that we cannot stand on them. And I think that is the opportunity of identity language about Jesus is saying that you are your truest self as you become more like him. And that is the fixed point. That is the immovable goal that isn't going to change. And so I think that's a really important way to be articulating the gospel to this particular cultural moment. But the other thing that I mentioned in that chapter that I think about all the time is I cite this book called The Paradox of Choice throughout the book. And he talks about how we live in this culture of choice overwhelm and how there's kind of this sweet spot where if you don't have enough choice, that's deprivation. But if you have too much choice, it becomes overwhelming and paralyzing. And we have swung hard in the choice overwhelm. And so people are really overwhelmed by, they're paralyzed by their choices all the time. And so he looks at different ways that this plays out. And he talks about ways that you can sort of thin the choices so that you don't feel paralyzed. But one chapter that he had that I was just stunned, because I think the book was written 20 years ago, is he says one area of choice overwhelm for our culture is in identity. And he listed all these different areas of identity. And, this was 20 years ago. And so he didn't I don't think he mentioned gender or sexual orientation at all. But I realized we are basically presenting young people with this infinite buffet of identity options. And we think that in doing that, we are serving them, but it's actually overwhelming. Yeah. And to some extent, that is a correction. Our previous generations, to be a woman meant two things. There was if you're a woman, this is your lot in life. If you are, a Black American, this is what is expected of you and believed about you. We had very limited identity categories, but we've kind of swung in the opposite direction. And we're saying you can literally be anything. And we think that this is liberating, but there's not enough of a boundary around it. And that actually becomes its own form of bondage. And that's what I love about Genesis 1 and 2, where you see that Adam and Eve are the most free any human has ever been, not in the absence of boundaries, but because of boundaries. And so that's something I think about a lot with my kids and just how I talk about their futures, what language am I using where I'm really empowering them. But the language that we use around calling and purpose is we ask them, what clues are you detecting that you can pay attention to of how God created you? Yeah. But we don't say you can be anything. I don't use that language.
That's so interesting, right? Because that's what I heard growing up.
Yeah.
I could be anything I wanted to be. And I think that's such a normal thing. And it has the right intention. It's a good-hearted, you can achieve whatever. Yeah. I think because what we can achieve now is so drastically different than what it was 30,
But what's really fascinating is, and that language comes out of the self-esteem movement. And I wrote about that in my first book, Free of Me. The same author, Jean Twenge, that I quoted in my sermon, I quote her a different book in Free of Me because she is fascinating. But she talks about how the self-esteem movement promised this self-confidence in people that it has not delivered on. And so there's all these studies showing that this language that was being used in the hopes that it would really build up young people, it hasn't worked, frankly. And so it's not that I think the heart of it was to really buttress young people, as they're going into the world, but it doesn't work the way that we think that it will.
Yeah. So when you talk about representing Jesus well, and you talk about calling a little bit, it's really interesting because in that passage where it lists out live a life according to your calling, the very next thing that talks about isn't like jobs, isn't roles. It's to be humble and kind and serve one another and love one another. And so what I think is so interesting about our perception of calling is so often we get wrapped up in this big old picture of what it is. And in reality, it's these simple things. It's a little bit of a detour, but I just think that's so interesting to think about. Wow. Okay. Identity. That's a big one. We talked about a lot there. I'm excited about though that I don't think that there are many voices that are even talking about that because it's scary. Right. But I think without saying anything crazy definitively, what it is offering us is a chance to really think like we've swung the pendulum, but we haven't thought about the consequences. And as you think about that, as you think about healthy identity and healthy control of your identity, what comes to mind?
Well, the first thing the question I would want to ask for anyone listening as they're thinking about this topic of identity is being honest about whether or not the language we're using is actually producing what it promises. And with a lot of this language about identity and like finding your true self, I think a lot of people are saying this will set you free, but when you like look behind the curtain of Instagram, you're seeing, no, it's not. Like this has not yielded for you like what you thought it was going to yield. And so again, that's why I love the very fixed idea of pursuing Jesus and saying that I am my truest self the more that I become like him. And so am I growing in love? Am I growing in kindness? Am I growing in mercy?
Your calling.
That is what we're called to at the end of the day. And that is also, even with the topic of calling, that's a really important compass because even your calling is going to change. Your calling, like when you start a family, when you have kids, there's different, or maybe you have an aging parent that you need to take care of. Like there's so many different life circumstances that can change and that can maybe prevent you from working in some way. But to know at the end of the day, your calling, your ultimate calling has not changed, will not change, regardless of like your life stage or life situation. And so knowing that at the end of the day, what you're called to, and at the end of the day, what your true self is what Jesus would be doing, how he would be living if he was in your shoes, if he was living your life. That is your measure of your true self.
Yeah, that is really good. And it's such a helpful barometer because when you have all the cultural things that you say you should become or should do, that's the one that can bring you back to some rock to stand on.
Yes.
And that's so good. I've just a couple more questions. I mean, we're finishing up here, but and you've been speaking for 3 hours today already before this, so thank you again. But I'm curious. I want to talk a little bit about body stuff because in this I admire your husband more. I haven't met him yet, but he's a wrestler, so I like him because I'm a wrestler growing up that way. But with that in mind, as you've talked about body stuff, have you been surprised by how many men talk about it with you or have reached out about it? Or I know that this is something that you wanted to make sure was in the book because I know wrestlers struggle with this, but I'm curious.
I actually have not heard from many men about this topic specifically. But it was really interesting to me when I was preaching in your church, and in all 3 services, I think, or at least 2 out of 3, when I made the comment about how if you don't think you struggle with controlling your body, it's probably because your body is still submitting to you and that you're probably just young and healthy. And the number of people that chuckled like I just said something deeply true. Yeah. And I think it was mostly older people. Yeah. And so I suspect that it's something that both men and women as they age are inevitably confronted with in a lot of different ways. And, but yeah, I haven't heard anything specific from men about it. But it was very important to me that I used an example that was related to men because men, I mean, I could go on and on about this, but a lot of the like Gnostic philosophy.
Describe Gnosticism for a second.
So Gnosticism is it's a philosophy, and it's dualistic in the sense that it elevates the spirit and the mind over the body or the material.
Yes.
And it plays out in a lot of different ways, but really anytime you hear someone sort of dissect a person and say like their true self is like their soul, but their body is almost just kind of the container of their soul.
Yep.
That is actually a form of Gnosticism.
It's not Christian.
And yeah, it's not. It's a heresy. It's an actual heresy.
Yes.
And so Gnosticism, part of the reason it exists is because we experience so much pain in our bodies. And especially in centuries, millennia before, when they didn't even have modern medicine, if you were chronically ill, there was no option for you. People didn't live as long. People were very, very aware of their bodies. Their bodies were a tremendous source of suffering. And Gnosticism, the people writing Gnostic philosophy were men.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good reflection of how embodied men are, even though we tend to be in a culture that treats women as being more like embodied in some ways. But it's definitely a struggle for men.
Oh, yeah. Men are way more vain than they realize they are. And they just don't say it verbally or outwardly.
Yeah.
Oh, man. There was something else. I lost it. It's okay. It's so true and so good. And it's helpful, I think, to think about the body thing. Sorry, lost my train of thought. But anyways, there's one last little bit. I mean, you wrote this book, and obviously it's hit a chord because it's a bestseller in a couple different categories. It's a huge deal. Mm-hmm. If you could sum up, like, what's the thing you just really want people to hear when they get into this book? What's the thing you want them to go in thinking about or looking to?
So when I was first in the editing stages of the book, and I was talking with the publisher about the design for the cover, and an initial suggestion, because you send them kind of ideas and like images that like we could put this on the cover. So early on I said, can we put a demon on the cover?
Okay.
And they were like, no, we cannot. And
Why?
then I was like, what if it's like really dark and ominous? Like that was the word I kept using, was like ominous. And even in the description on Amazon, if you go to the description, one of the first things it says is that control is a devil's deal. And even that, my publisher did not like that. And they wanted to take it out because the way that you market a book is it's positive and inspiring and, it's aspirational and all of that. And so apparently a demon on the cover and talking about control being a devil's deal was like not on their marketing checklist.
I think it would have sold just millions of books.
But the reason I was really pushing this and the reason I still got the devil's deal language is that for me was the thing that really woke me up to what was happening whenever I was trying to control a situation. And before, when I would think I just shouldn't control this situation, I need to let go because it's not good that I'm trying to control, that was not helpful to me at all when I was in the middle of it. Like knowing you shouldn't control something is not as helpful as knowing why. And so this was my why of realizing it's not just that I don't have control. It's not just that I shouldn't have control, but it is going to cost me. And that's a different question when I'm, disagreeing with my husband and about a big decision for our church, which is a big deal, and thinking this really matters, getting my way here really matters. Now asking the question, I can get my way here, but it is going to cost my marriage. Is it worth it? And that is such a different question that for me, 100% of the time is no, it is not worth it to hit my marriage. And so that is really, even though it's not like uplifting and there's uplifting pieces, like it ends on, our hope in Christ. But that really is that sobering reality, so that we're not, control is just deeply in defiance of reality is really what it is. And so just accepting the fact that this is reality, that was the wake-up call that I needed. And so I'm hopeful that it will be similarly helpful to everyone else.
That's awesome. There's one line you said during your sermon today that I could, without any audible signs, look around and see every person just like rocked by it. And that was, you all have somebody, most likely, that is headed towards something bad, and you wish you could do something about it. And when you said that, I looked out, and I could tell that it hit so many people. But what I love about your message is that the desire to control those people is the devil's deal. And it will not result in what they want.
Right.
And so I was so grateful that you were here and that you could share this message. So thank you. And I just want to appreciate you being here, and I appreciate the time that you spend with our people and the message that you brought. And if you want to get to know you or follow you, where can they find you?
I'm most active on Instagram, so just Sharon H. Miller.
Awesome. And definitely find The Cost of Control and pick it up. It is a fantastic book. And with that, we'll be back in a couple weeks, and have yourself a great one.